Hello and welcome to the Proptech Hot Seat on iPropertyRadio with myself, Carol Tallon, the show where we explore the trends and technologies driving innovation across the built environment. This show is brought to you in partnership with Proptech Ireland, the hub for innovators, investors and indeed for industry leaders. In the Proptech Hot Seat today is Scott Langbein, Global Director at Topcon Positioning Systems. Scott, you're very welcome. Thank you for joining us today.
Hello, Carol. Thanks for inviting me on.
I'm delighted. We've spoken to a number of your colleagues in Topcon in the past, so I'm delighted that you were in a position to join us. I know you're joining us from Northern California today, so we appreciate the time and effort that took. So thank you so much. Scott, I mentioned there that you're joining us in the capacity of Global Director at Topcon Positioning Systems, and we're always curious before we even launch into a conversation about the Topcon offering. I'm always curious about the state of tech adoption across the construction industry and particularly where Ireland ranks in that. So you might just give us an overview as to tech adoption in general across the construction industry.
Sure. It's a great question. Pretty broad topic, but I think that what we see from Topcon, and we are a global organization. We have distribution and engineering around the world. We have certain specialties in earth moving and geopositioning, as well as agricultural positioning as well. I would say in construction, the challenges we see, the trends that we see are that the customers know that they want to go through a digital transformation. The customers are hearing about it, shows like yourself, other publications, they're hearing and seeing this topic of digital transformation. So a lot of construction companies are going to trade shows or sending somebody from their company to go find out what the heck what does this mean for me? And because the construction industry is so broad, there are some very sophisticated construction companies that we know of, and then there are less sophisticated, all the way to a mom and pop or a father-son construction company that also faces that digital transformation challenge. So many of them are jumping in with new software applications, excuse me, new CAD tools or modeling tools, or even tracking your human resources and your time cards. Some really fantastic tools and applications out there that construction companies are starting to use, but they're really, I have to admit, they're struggling a bit on maintaining all of these various applications, all these different softwares and pieces, and they're having a hard go of it, really, to make it efficient.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because what we've seen particularly, and what I'm always curious about as well, is when we look at different regions and different countries, while the trajectory is the same, the pace at which the adoption, the pace of digital adoption is very different, but the drivers can be very different as well in terms of local and regional regulations, and generally the restrictions put on money financing these projects. So the drivers can be very different. So in terms of, you mentioned there a particular specialty, say in terms of earth moving, and we know in the context of the ongoing carbon conversation we're having, that's particularly interesting. So what are you seeing as some of the key drivers of digital adoption right now?
Well, as you mentioned, I think you mentioned the standards or regulations. Governments have started to take a role in mandating beyond just the machine efficiency, but looking at an overall project, whether it's a building project or an earth moving project, trying to ask the contractor to measure or report. Actually, the correct terminology that I see in the industry is they're asking them to report on carbon emission. And that leaves a really wide gap before the reporting. The big gap is, how do I record that information, or how do I track it? And you need to have a plan per company and per project to be able to measure. The old phrase, if you can't manage what you don't measure, right? Mm-hmm. So we have to put together some better standards of how people are able to measure, so that we're able to compare on a fair basis, project to project, how the two projects compared. But the measuring of carbon emissions and the measurement of machine activities, the measurement of all of your supply chain pieces coming into a building, trying to prove the carbon footprint of a new structure is really challenging for our construction colleagues and customers.
It's interesting. You're talking about the gap that has to happen prior to reporting, and knowing still that's a very imperfect. It's a very imperfect way that we're getting to reporting. It actually maybe raises question marks over the benchmarking then that we're doing, which is based on that reporting when we see the gap before that. And look, we might come back to talk about that in the context of sustainability. But what I'm really keen to talk to you about today, I've watched a demo of the Topcon Positioning Systems new Aptix integration platform, and it's particularly compelling given that you described some of the parties trying to adopt tech as struggling, and we know that that's true. We're in a position where there's a lot of choice and people maybe don't understand how the different systems work well together and integrate. So you might just talk us through, for anybody who hasn't seen it, but I will of course link to the demo video, the Aptix integration platform. What is it and how does it work?
Yeah, so when I mentioned that the construction industry is struggling, I mean that in all due respect. It's a legitimate challenge with all of the software applications that have come out to the market in the last 10 years. So from a high level, Aptix, it connects the things that should be connected. It's a very easy way to think it through, that if you're a construction company and you're running CAD software and design software, scheduling software, machine management, material management software, you could end up with an ongoing organization running with 20 different software pieces that each do a very good job in what they're supposed to do. So that's why we've seen construction companies adopt these applications. But what they're faced with now is they've got this information at 20 different applications, but they're not connected, and the data is not being used and stored in a way that benefits the overall company. So Topcon has invested in this integration platform, which doesn't replace these applications. So it's important to understand that an integration platform doesn't replace the very useful applications and softwares that a construction company is using. It simply connects them together. It's an additional layer. In my mind, it's at the top of the page. It's the layer that connects all of the other pieces in the organization. So we know that it simplifies the challenge. It brings an easier view of your construction project or your construction company operations, and hopefully makes this data management challenge an easier one to get a handle on. Yeah.
Scott, without being flippant, does the industry know? I mean, I think I think that's a very compelling way to say it. It connects the things that ought to be connected. But does the industry know of all the systems it's using? Do they know what needs to be connected? Because we are talking about a very early stage of tech adoption where people are trialing and piloting and maybe using new systems, and they don't have an expectation that those systems speak to each other.
It's a very, very good question. I can tell you we had a conversation as a management team yesterday about what do we need to provide with Aptix. And I think the question you just asked points to that because we have some experience with all around the world, we'll find a customer that's committed to learning and changing their organization in the pursuit of being more digital. We, Topcon, need to find a way to provide that information as well as the product called Aptix. So there is we look at it as a kind of an adoption challenge, because a customer can take on Aptix and start using it, but it is a new approach, connecting the things that previously weren't. And believe me, these companies have been operating successfully. I'm not here to say that they're not successful, but Aptix is an additional layer on top of that just pulls out the efficiencies and makes it very visible to the organization of what management choices they need to make on making the project run better. So it's it's interesting that we're figuring that out now. What do we need to bring the information and the training and the best practices to bring to the industry with the product, and also look at other organizations, professional organizations of general contractor organizations or societies of engineers. How are we going to educate the market that these integration platforms and the multitude of applications can really run better, can really be connected and run better.
I think you made the point very well that actually you're integrating current systems being used, not replacing any. And so I think it's important to stress here that we're not just talking about a platform for existing Topcon positioning systems tools. So actually you are bringing in ones that at an industry level might look like competitors, whereas actually they're systems that do very different jobs and different functions on and off site for the industry. How does that process work? I mean, is there almost a cultural challenge that needs to be overcome there as well?
Yeah, there's two. Good point. There's a cultural challenge, and then there's pure technical challenge. The technical challenge is becoming easier, and you may hear people refer to APIs or the API economy. So most modern software applications today do provide an API connection to their data or to their application. And that's where the integration platform really shines. Aptix uses that API logic to connect multiple applications to our platform at the same time. So that's the technical part. And I'm not a coder, I'm not a developer, so I don't give enough credit to the development team of how hard that is. But to me, when I see these other software applications in the industry publishing their API menu or stack, I'm happy to see that they're willing to work with others. So I think it's important from a technical point of view when our customers are looking at softwares to use, they need to consider that. Like, can this software work with other softwares? And that should be a decision that or something they look at when they're making a decision on what to use. The second point there is the culture change. That is the biggest challenge to maintaining use or adopting something new. I've sat in large rooms where you hear the theory of it has to be a top-down mandate, and it has to work from the top. The boss has to agree, and then the next boss has to agree. I agree to some extent, but I also feel that to really benefit from some of these new connections, you simply have to turn the other stuff off. You have to say, like, we're not going to let that connection happen. Like, you have to say, we're not going to let the business be run by Excel anymore. So we have to have that cultural change within the organization. And then a really good point was made 2 weeks ago at the International Highway Engineer Conference is you have to protect your change makers. So when there's somebody in a construction company who's passionate about technology and digital adoption, that is a change maker within that organization. And you have to protect that person because that person is going to take risks. And sometimes they're not always going to work. Something the first time they try won't work. And if you don't protect that change maker, your culture is not going to change. Your culture is not going to the business culture of that company is not going to change to adopt these new technologies.
That is such a powerful message. Protect your change makers. Actually, one of the conversations we've had only in very recent weeks, and it was around a conversation for tech adoption for planning departments within local governments. And one of the realizations is that within a local authority, a local government setting, there is no willingness to fail. There's no ability for people to fail. And I mean, I'm saying fail. Really, there's no ability then to integrate and allow the natural process, which we know are some things work, some things don't. I'm not even sure fail is the right word for it, but there's no not only there's no appetite, there's actually no capacity for it. And actually, if you've no capacity to get things wrong, then you've got no capacity to innovate. And that's it. I mean, there's a direct correlation there. So it's really interesting. And I think, protect your change makers should really be the mantra for all innovators, because whether they're happening at a public or private sector, large organization or small, we've seen that this willingness to get things wrong is really, if that's not enabled, then you just won't have the tech adoption that you need. And I think with construction, because it's such a low margin business, that sometimes it's not an ego or an unwillingness to get it wrong. It's really that there isn't the margin to get it wrong to any great extent. And in a way, I think that's why we've seen some smaller companies being able to take the lead, because their margins are not so tight as some of the larger companies. So it's been really interesting to see the dynamic of players in the industry change over the past 5 to 10 years, purely because of tech adoption and the pace at which they were able to do it, and the agility to turn things around when things aren't going well. By the way, I just, in terms of the boss has to agree top-down approach, we actually had a situation in our own company when we switched to a very expensive special software that was falling short on the communications. I loved it as again, from a manager point of view, it had all the tools, it had all the reporting we wanted. The team refused to give up Slack. And to me, it did not make sense to be paying for this expensive software and then still using Slack and still having to, and the team revolted. They would not, because of the shortcomings in the existing. And since then, that was fed back into the software provider. Since then, they have actually integrated with Slack because our experience was not unique. And I think it's really interesting. Anybody who thinks that tech, particularly on a construction site, is going to be top down, then that is doomed to failure, because actually, if you don't make lives easier for those on and off site and those on the road between sites, then it's not going to be adopted. There is just no way. So I think the top-down approach just doesn't work in a construction. You have a global perspective, but what are you seeing in terms of, because so much of this is culture change as well, can you point to examples of what you think does work when we're talking about creating a culture shift?
Yeah, so in the 15, 20 years that I've been observing construction projects, in my mind, there's been a change, and it's been slower than expected. I guess I would have to admit, surprised it's changed. But if you look back at the measurement methods and really just measuring one point at a time, we call it the discrete point measurement. It used to be you had a surveyor or a field engineer who would put a piece of wood in the ground, right, to mark a point in the construction project. And when we started as a technology company telling folks, you don't need to do that. You don't need to put stakes in the ground for grading. The machine can automatically grade. Gosh, they didn't believe us. They didn't believe us back then, 20 years ago. So we had to prove it. And I think it's the resiliency of our organization and other technology companies that are just a little bit extra passionate about construction, that we're willing to go back again and again to talk to a construction company to say, do you remember the day when you had to put a wooden stake in the ground to manage the grade of your project? Of course they remember. But now you look at a job site and there aren't any stakes because the machines are blade controlled, and you had automated machine guidance on so many machines. So what we're seeing is now a next level of automation, where it took many years for Topcon to convince our users that we can control your blade or the bucket. We have technology that will integrate with that machine and control the blade and the bucket of that machine, and you will have fantastic results, production results. What we're saying now in very simple terms is we now have a platform that will automate your business processes. So we're looking to, rather than just control the blade position, we're now looking at controlling your business operation.
Oh, that's almost too big when you take it as a whole. But breaking it down, in terms of the tech adoption, you describe as slower than expected over 15 to 20 years. But that's almost taking a linear approach. And we know that adoption doesn't work like that. So where have the jumps been, like pre and post COVID? Because, it may be a case that where we are now is not as far as where you expect it to be 15 or 20 years ago, but we know that there have been jumps and jumps that have been, I don't think we can use the word exponential, but they've definitely been disproportionate maybe to ones we saw at different points. If you point to pre and post COVID, where are you seeing those jumps? When did the industry really start to take notice?
That's a good question. Where would I have seen so if we try to shorten the timeline, looking back just prior to COVID, the infrastructure construction, especially infrastructure projects, were absolutely necessary. So we all got a little nervous. I was at the ConExpo show in March of 2000 in Las Vegas, massive construction show. And we all went home a day early because COVID was coming in and the schools were going to close the next week and all that. But after we all were a little panicked for a few weeks, the construction industry had to get back to work. So what if you remember the social distancing, staying, keeping track, what I really liked, I think COVID helped accelerate the adoption of that measurement gap. Remember earlier in our conversation, I said the measurement gap for CO2 emissions. Well, there's also a measurement gap for your man hours or tracking your time cards for your people. And you can do that in a very loose way. At the end of the week, you ask Bob, how many hours did you work on this project? And Bob can tell you at the end of the week. Or you use a measurement system to track Bob's time. And what we saw in COVID, we saw technologies pop up that were willing to be used, or the construction companies were willing to use them to better track. So they were tracking their machines better with telematics. They were being able to run automatic reports on what their machines were doing, their tool time, whether the tools were being utilized, their man hour time. And they were able to, they felt compelled to measure it so that they could prove that they were doing the right thing for their employees and not exposing them to too much COVID exposure, or somebody had COVID and exposing 20 other people. You had to measure. Like you can't just wing it and say, oh well, somebody had COVID and I don't know who else was on the project. But so we became much more willing to measure what was going on the project. That just came to mind quickly, Kara. I don't know.
No, but that's an interesting one. Yeah. Were you able to use that opportunity maybe to distinguish between or maybe compare the assumptions that people had before they actually started measuring, and then those assumptions compared with the data, what the data was telling them? Was there a gap?
Yeah, well, that's what we're doing. That's what we're doing now. Like literally today with the Aptix is usually there's a high level of intuitive intelligence in construction. So a high level of experience. The people that are estimating a project and putting together the plan of execution are very experienced. They're the few in the company that have been there forever and ever. They have an assumption in many cases of what it's going to take to do the next project. If you're not measuring what's going on throughout the entire project, you're never going to know for sure. I mean, you can get to the end of the project and realize that there's some material left over or money left over, but measuring that benchmark and adjusting the benchmark per project is critical, and especially in those tight margin projects that you were mentioning. That, but I like to say, when would it not be beneficial? Even if let's say you're doing some road paving project and there is a margin in there. It's related to the amount of asphalt you're paving. So there's a bit of a margin. Why would you not want to measure what's going on every step of the way so that you can bid it better next time? So
I don't think it ever comes down to why would you not do it. It's that there's a cost involved in everything. So the trade-off is the cost. Will there be a return? Because actually that's one distinction I found between, say, in terms of innovation and tech adoption and non-tech innovation across. There's a big difference between real estate and construction in this. Real estate doesn't like to spend money unless it can be seen. So it's a very market first, very visible. Whereas construction, it's very ROI. It's absolutely down to the return on investment. So it's not. I don't think it's a case of firms. Why would they not do it? It's can you make the business case for it? Can you show the return? And if you can show the return on investment, then it will absolutely be done. And that's a key distinction between the drivers and the enablers of tech adoption in construction and real estate. Construction is very data led in terms of the return on investment. So it's enabling that. And I suppose, it's interesting actually. I was at a presentation with global cost consultants Turner and Townsend recently, and Bryn Griffith, the speaker there, talked about the two currencies of construction now, one being cash and one being carbon, which was just so powerful. And so actually, when we talk about return on investment, we're no longer just talking about the return on investment in terms of cash, but actually it's carbon. And that's something that we weren't able to account as easily in our bank balances previously. So I'm conscious of your time here, but you might just talk to us about the capability for, I suppose, for carbon measuring, because that's such an important part of this. Is this covered under the Aptix integration platform?
Yeah, Aptix has two functions that really help the carbon emission measurement and reporting. We're able to do mixed fleet telematics tracking. So you're probably quite familiar with the brands Caterpillar, Komatsu, John Deere, Liebherr, different brands that are out there running. These machines are typically connected. There's a data connection to them to track, but each of them have their own telematics ecosystem, or think of it as a screen on a computer screen. So if I need to track John Deere, I go to the John Deere system and I track my John Deere machines. And then I go over to Komatsu and I track there. Aptix can pool all of those machine types, large machines, small machines, into one dashboard location to track the machine activity. So there we're able to track the fuel burn, which equates over to our carbon emissions. And the second aspect is it's able to automate the reporting of that. So because the machines are digitally connected to Aptix, the report just naturally generates. It's a graph in the bottom right-hand corner, and it simply shows you what all your machines have been doing. And you just hit a drop-down menu and say, I want to see where am I plan versus actual. So your baseline talk you mentioned before, baseline plan versus actual perform. And you can see it clear as day, and you can sort by date, time, specific machine, specific operator, a certain type of task. You can sort and quickly get to the detail of what is causing me extra fuel burn, and therefore what is causing me extra CO2 emission that maybe I didn't plan for clearly enough in the beginning. So we're finding that that trend is a bit more solid in Europe. That we're seeing the European construction companies needing to adopt that. So far in the U.S., it's a little less on needing to track, but we're evangelizing it in the U.S. to get those early adopter construction companies embracing their carbon emission tracking of all their machines.
Very good. Again, comes back to our conversation about the drivers, and I think interestingly, it wasn't even the regulations across Europe that was driving it. Was the regulations on funds. So it was the money coming into projects that was really one of the early drivers, which is not usual. But it was an interesting observation to see. Scott, thank you so much for being so generous with your time. Final question today, just because we are always trying to spot the opportunities for prop tech and construction tech startups. In terms of your integration platform, how receptive are you to innovators and early stage prop tech and construction technology companies actually being integrating on your platform?
Very open. We have a dedicated space in the product for our integration marketplace, and believe me, I'm open. Our management team is open, and Topcon knows that innovation happens in sometimes very small organizations or a one-man band innovation. We're very much open because we need to stay connected and we need to connect to those new innovation pieces.
I'm delighted to hear that, and I would encourage anybody involved in a PropTech or construction technology startup that would be relevant here, maybe to check that out. But we will, of course, include a link to the demo video because it's particularly interesting, and it will show people maybe the capability that they're just not even aware of. I think, Scott, I'm going to sum up the platform, and please correct me if you need, but I'm going to sum it up as correcting the things that it should be connected. And so essentially we want to make sure that the industry knows of the current technologies they're using and the ones that they're exploring right now, that they understand that these systems and technologies should really be communicating together, and that this might be the right platform to do it. Did I summarize that? Did I summarize that accurately?
I think you do. It's all about integration and connections. Yes.
Yeah. So technology mirroring real life. I like it. Scott, thank you so much. That was Scott Langbein, Global Director at Topcon Positioning Systems. Thank you so much for joining us. And
thank you.
If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to subscribe to the podcast and check out all of the other real estate and construction shows on iPropertyRadio. Before we go, a special word of thanks to our sponsor, Proptech Ireland, for supporting the podcast and for making these conversations possible. And thank you indeed for tuning in. We'll catch you on the next episode of the Proptech Hot Seat here on iPropertyRadio.